Hello and thank you for joining me today on The Political Conversationalist. My name is Ben Phipps, and today we're still talking about systems of government. We're going to talk about what's known as an oligarchy. Oligarchies are probably the worst form of government ever invented, and it's any government you have in which the minority rule over the majority. So it wouldn't be like in America where we have voting or anything like that. It would be a ruling class and then everyone else. There are two main types of this. There's an aristocracy, and in an aristocracy you have some kind of supposedly better elite class that can rule over the rest of them, which are supposedly not as good, and normally that's based on race. Secondly, there is a plutocracy in which you have a rich class and the rest of the people, being middle class and impoverished, are ruled over by the rich. I found a couple good examples today. So, South Africa, the country of South Africa, was first under Dutch rule, then under British colonialism, and in 1910 it became its own nation. In 1913, however, they passed the Land Act, which delegated 80% of the land for whites and the other 20% for blacks, but the opposite was true of the population. It was 80% black and 20% white, roughly. And it forced blacks to live in that 20% of the land. They would go on to make it illegal for them to be in the white land, 80% of their own country, without having documentation as to why they were there, and they could arrest them. In 1950, it became illegal for interracial marriage or even interracial sexual relations. And in 1958, they divided the reserves, or the lands that were reserved for blacks. They divided those into Bantustans, which were just subdivisions to try to kind of keep them divided and keep them from revolting. That didn't really work, and there were a lot of revolts, some peaceful, some not, in South Africa, but it took a lot of international pressure from the UN and other places and all kinds of sanctioning to get any kind of meaningful change there. But it was almost as if two different countries. If you lived in South Africa and you were white, it was a great place to live. If you lived in South Africa and you were black, it was a horrible place to live. Blacks couldn't vote, they couldn't assemble and have meetings and things like that. They had to stay on what was called their land. They couldn't serve in government. And it took until 1994 before all those racist laws were repealed, and they had their first truly democratic election, and that's when they elected Nelson Mandela president of South Africa. And he's a very important key figure we'll look at separately in another video. But it took until 1994 for South Africa to get racist laws off the books. So we always focus on racism in America, but it's a lot worse in other places. Now, the second example I found is a plutocracy, where you have a ruling rich class. And this is not a set in stone, this is how it works. This is actually kind of a conspiracy theory, but it's one backed by the U.S. government. The U.S. Treasury released a list of 200 Russian rulers. And these 200 rulers, 114 of them were in the government, but 96 of them were what they called oligarchs, which means they were so rich that they had considerable political sway. And mainly the way this works is that a lot of the major companies inside of Russia seem to be protected by the Kremlin and Putin. Now again, I say this is kind of a conspiracy theory, but the government is with me. For instance, there was one called, it's an oil company in Russia, it's called Surgutneftsgas, I'm probably saying that wrong, where they had a man looking into their financials, and he was charged with fraud, tax evasion, both of which were false charges, and forced to flee the country of Russia to avoid being arrested. So Surgutneftsgas is obviously one of the companies that is kind of under the state of Russia's protection. Now, why that is, not really sure. But it seems that in Russia, there's a certain point where you or your company can get big enough to be above the law. And those people have sway with the government, and the government has sway with those people. So in some ways, it is like a plutocracy. Not set in stone, but it is like a plutocracy. Hopefully you've learned something today. But the most important takeaway is oligarchies are probably the worst type of government because they are the most divisive. they set up a class that's supposedly better, whether it be by race or money or whatever, and then they set up everyone else and make them live under a supposedly better class. And that's why it's so unpopular. I mean, we have other things like republics and democracies that tend to treat people a lot more fairly. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.